This meeting is being recorded.
A very warm welcome to everyone joining us from all over the world for this OECD Global Anti-Corruption and Integrity Forum webinar. My name is Axel Threlfall. I'm editor at large at Reuters based out of London, and I am delighted to have been asked once again to host this fascinating forum. Its 8th edition and the first time it has been held virtually, a phrase I'm sure you are all getting very used to hearing in this current context. Allow me a few very brief words to set the scene and lay out some basic housekeeping, then I'll introduce the panel and we'll get things underway. A very quick Zoom tip from me. If you want the person speaking to be full screen and the other speakers in small boxes down the right of your screen, just click on the speaker view box in the top right-hand corner of your screen. So that is one quick Zoom tip. As the world battles the COVID-19 health emergency and juggles the economic and the social ramifications of it, as it continues simultaneously to try and stave off environmental disaster, we've all become acutely aware of the importance of being prepared when crises strike and of the folly of postponing bold, forward-looking decisions. Now, today's discussion focuses on something specific but critical as we try and navigate our way through the crisis, namely the risks of corruption and integrity violations in the COVID-19 response and recovery. It should come really as no great surprise to anyone watching this that the crisis has fostered an environment that increases the risk of corruption, of undue influence, and of bribery, be it in emergency procurement, economic recovery measures, or international business transactions. This can, of course, put lives at risk. It can distort markets, divert vital healthcare resources, and further damage already deteriorating levels of trust in government and business at a time when we need that trust most. So today we aim to identify and recognize the increased challenges, what has changed, how government and business need to address these risks and maintain the rule of law, public integrity, and business ethics. We have a really superb panel representing all of the relevant perspectives in this debate. The OECD, of course, provides a perfect forum for such a discussion by supporting governments and economies in their responses to such crises. Various policy notes, by the way, on the COVID-19 response can be found on the OECD homepage. Right, a little bit of housekeeping, then I'll stop talking. The webinar is going to last 90 minutes. Please do get involved and submit any questions you have via the chat function. That's accessible at the bottom panel of the screen, which will appear when you hover over the bottom of the screen. Please try and keep your questions short. That way the chat moderator will able to navigate more easily through them. Do keep them coming throughout the discussion, and I will try and get to as many of them as I can. I'll also dedicate about 20 minutes at the end for the traditional Q&A segment. Rania from the forum team is going to be launching 3 polling questions that we'd love your thoughts on. They will appear on your screens during the discussion, and I'll prompt you to respond to those when they do, and then we'll take a look at those responses, and that will inform our discussion as we move forward. The webinar has French interpretation. To access this, click the globe icon on the bottom panel and select French. Note to our speakers, if you're listening to the interpretation, please turn it off when you take the floor, otherwise we'll get some interference. Please also note the following disclaimer. Interpretation of remote meetings on Zoom serves to facilitate communication and does not constitute an authentic record. Only the original speech is authentic. Interventions that are too fast or read out where the sound quality is insufficient may have to go uninterpreted. And finally, I wanted to mention this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube. It's also being recorded, and the recording will be made available on the OECD Anti-Corruption and Integrity Hub after the session. Okay, that's my intro. Let me introduce our speakers. OECD Deputy Secretary General Jeff Schlagenhauf, who's going to provide some brief opening remarks in just a moment. Drago is chair of the OECD Working Group on Bribery. Marco Reggiani, General Counsel for Legal, Governance, Compliance of SNAM and Vice Chair of Business at OECD Anti-Corruption Committee. Anne Rivera, head of the Competence Center for Contracts and Procurement and head of the FDFA Compliance Office in Switzerland, and is also co-chair of the OECD Working Party of Senior Public Integrity Officials. And Barbara Trionfi is Executive Director at the International Press Institute. As you can see, as I said, we have all of the really important perspectives covered here. That is enough from me for now. Let me give the virtual floor to the OECD's Deputy Secretary General Jeff Schlagenhauf for his opening remarks. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of our participants around the world. I hope that you are all keeping safe and well and managing to stay positive in these unsettling times. As you know, the OECD Global Anti-Corruption and Integrity Forum will take place in a different format this year in order to ensure the safety of our guests and staff during the coronavirus pandemic. This webinar is the first in a series of virtual forum events, and I'm pleased that so many of you have found a way to participate. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to take a brief moment here to give a special shout out and thank you to the United Kingdom for their long-standing support for OECD's work on anti-corruption and integrity, which we value especially in a situation where the world is facing one of the biggest health and economic crises in history. The COVID-19 pandemic is putting lives at risk and threatening the stabilities of our democracies, our economies, and our societies, with developing countries likely to be hit the hardest. It is forcing governments across the world to take quick decisions to implement drastic measures to protect communities at risk and limit the economic fallout of the pandemic. The unprecedented economic and fiscal measures implemented as part of the crisis response represent a stress test for public integrity and public financial management systems. All this creates opportunities for integrity violations, bribery, fraud, and corruption, which in turn have the potential to undermine the effectiveness of response and recovery efforts and weaken trust in government and businesses. Today's webinar will look at how governments and businesses can address corruption and integrity risks during the COVID-19 crisis. The pandemic has hit after many years of declining trust in governments and institutions. However, there's some good news coming out of this difficult situation. The 2020 Edelman Trust Barometer Spring Update reveals that amid the COVID-19 pandemic, trust in government has surged to an all-time high in a number of countries, making it the most trusted institution for the first time since the study was launched 20 years ago. As more citizens turn to their governments for leadership and assistance, how can we ensure that this newfound trust in governments is not undermined by corruption or integrity violations as we pursue the road to recovery? The OECD, as the global anti-corruption and integrity standard setter, is channeling its efforts to support policymakers as they mitigate the short-term impact of the crisis and address medium and long-term challenges in a number of key areas for action. First, accountability, control, and oversight of economic stimulus packages. To mitigate the economic recession caused by COVID-19, governments are deploying significant economic stimulus packages. Paradoxically, they're relaxing controls in order to urgently spend funds. At the same time, the crisis is also disrupting the institutions that are typically responsible for accountability and oversight in government. In some cases, parliamentary oversight committees have been suspended due to public health concerns. Many supreme audit institutions are facing difficulties conducting audits and have postponed the publication of audit reports. Tax administrations, which in most jurisdictions play a crucial role as gatekeepers of the fiscal stimulus, have postponed tax assessments and audits. Despite the pressures, it is key to recall that internal control, audit, and oversight functions play a critical role in ensuring that public integrity is not compromised, so that the economic stimulus packages can produce the intended benefits. Second, protecting the rule of law and upholding anti-corruption obligations. The potential for abuses to the rule of law is particularly worrying in the current situation, where executive power is bolstered in an effort to curb the pandemic, for instance, through the declaration of states of emergency. As underlined in the recent statement by the Working Group on Bribery, now more than ever, we need to apply rigorously all standards and tools at our disposal, like the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention and our recommendations on public integrity and managing risk of corruption and development cooperation. Economic bailout measures should not pave the way for impunity for economic and financial crime. Third, ensuring integrity in the procurement process. With many countries and institutions buying and importing vital medical equipment and supplies through emergency procurement processes, we must not cut corners, but make every effort to keep corruption out of these processes to avoid putting further lives at risk. In the absence of proper integrity and transparency safeguards, emergency COVID-19 response processes are highly susceptible to abuse. And this is particularly the case in developing countries where market gaps and inconsistencies in public procurement were prevalent even before the onset of the crisis. Companies rapidly adapting to providing new products and services in sectors such as healthcare need guidance on the specific risk involved. Such risk also include the spread of counterfeits, for which the crisis provides an unfortunate opportunity, as we have seen, for instance, with the recent seizure of fraudulent test, medication, and personal protective equipment in Baltimore, Maryland. Fourth, making funds transparent and accountable. The billions of dollars being dispersed to both developed and developing countries must be used in a transparent and accountable manner to ensure that vital medical supplies and services reach those who need them, helping the most vulnerable. The OECD has vast experience in managing risk of corruption and in areas such as e-government and asset declarations, which can be harnessed to this end. Fifth, maintaining a culture of business integrity. The world is watching closely as businesses strive to cope with this emergency. All companies, including SOEs and SMEs, should ensure that good governance and internal controls are maintained using a risk-based approach. We recognize that there will be vast cuts to financial and human resources, and the safety and well-being of employees will be the first priority. There is a need to look at how best to ensure effective business integrity and fair competition, including through ODA programming with as little cost to business as possible. Finally, protecting those brave and strong enough to call out corruption. Information saves lives. In times of crisis, whistleblowers are especially important as the normal oversight of decision-making is weakened. We need to make whistleblowing safe, and we need to defend and respect an independent and free press. Those who expose corruption must be protected, not intimidated, jailed, or killed. As you can see, the challenges related to the crisis are manifold. We look forward to delving into them during the webinar today and those to follow in the coming weeks. On this note, let me invite you all to join us again for the launch of the OECD Public Integrity Handbook at the same time on Wednesday, 20th of May, followed by a discussion of emergency measures to protect whistleblowers and promote reporting during the COVID-19 crisis and beyond, taking place on Friday, the 22nd of May. You can count on the OECD to support you in your work, in fighting corruption and in upholding integrity. This is an important crisis that we need to address. We need to protect it from corruption and protect public safety in our economies. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeff. And while you were speaking, Jeff, questions have started rolling in. We've got close to 1,000 attendees from across the globe. Questions on procurement of medical supplies, on overseeing direct cash transfer programs, and I will get to those questions in due course. Just before we get to the panelists, I want to put up the first polling question, if I could. And Rania is going to put that up on your screens now. And there it is. Question 1, which of the COVID-19 mitigation and response measures entails the highest integrity risks? Is it emergency procurement in the healthcare sector, economic support packages to companies, social benefit packages to individuals and households, international COVID-19 disaster response financing, and emergency measures and restrictions on movement and communication? Choose your option there, and we will put the result up in just a moment. And whilst we're waiting for that, by the way, I will ask our speakers to start. And I'm going to break this up into 3 chunks of questions, if you like. And the first is a little bit of context from our panelists. Anne Rivera, let me kick it off with you. From your perspective as head of public procurement and compliance in Switzerland, what for you are the standout emerging integrity risks that arise from government responses here?
Oui, bonjour à toutes et tous depuis la Suisse. Merci Axel pour cette question pertinente et merci à l'OCDE de m'avoir invité à participer à ce webinaire. D'abord, j'aimerais préciser que les phénomènes de corruption et de détournement ne sont pas nouveaux. Néanmoins, il est vrai que la crise du Covid a amplifié ces phénomènes et a créé de nouvelles occasions. C'est pour ça qu'il est important que les gouvernements y apportent une attention particulière. À mon avis, l'un des domaines les plus à risque actuellement en lien avec la crise, ce sont les marchés publics. Et je vois surtout trois défis. D'une part, les adjudications de gré à gré, le recours aux adjudications de gré à gré en invoquant l'exception de l'urgence. Ce type de procédures urgentes sont certes légales et sûrement plus adaptées à ces situations que les procédures ordinaires d'appel d'offres. Néanmoins, elles augmentent les risques d'intégrité. Donc, on a des problèmes liés au fait qu'on n'a pas le temps de faire des évaluations de risques liés aux partenaires. On n'a pas le temps de vérifier si leurs comptes sont en ordre, s'ils font l'objet d'une procédure pénale ou si, par exemple, ils ont un solide système de contrôle interne. En outre, on n'a pas le temps non plus de comparer les prix avec ce type de procédure. Et donc, il est possible qu'on soit victime de prix surfacturés, surfaits. Le deuxième défi, c'est la planification défaillante des stocks de biens nécessaires pour la protection de la santé publique, par exemple les masques, les appareils médicaux, les appareils respiratoires médicaux, les produits de désinfection. Souvent, ces produits ont, avec le temps, été externalisés à l'étranger, la production a été externalisée, et donc, en période de crise, ces biens deviennent rares. Apparaissent alors des phénomènes d'exacerbation de la compétition entre les États, ce qui affaiblit les États, une volatilité extrême des prix, puisqu'il y a une nette augmentation de la demande et une raréfaction de l'offre. On constate un changement de paradigme en matière de corruption. Certains États peuvent être tentés de corrompre les entreprises pour obtenir ces biens rares, alors que d'habitude c'est plutôt l'inverse. Et on voit aussi s'installer des phénomènes où les vendeurs profitent de cette situation pour exiger le paiement d'avances faramineuses et pour imposer leurs conditions. Le troisième défi se situe, à mon avis, au niveau de la gestion des contrats en cours. Ça demande une certaine flexibilité. Donc, ce qu'on va devoir faire, c'est souvent payer des avances sans avoir eu vraiment le temps de vérifier si le travail est suffisamment avancé. On n'aura pas le temps de demander des rapports intermédiaires qui sont d'habitude prévus dans les contrats, des rapports financiers, des rapports opérationnels intermédiaires. Et donc, ça peut entraîner certains problèmes au niveau des contrôles qui ne peuvent pas avoir lieu, ou on va devoir exempter les fournisseurs de toute pénalité s'ils sont en retard ou si la performance est moindre. Donc, ça devient plus difficile d'obtenir les services ou les biens qu'on a commandés, qui étaient prévus dans le contrat, avec la qualité requise. Un deuxième domaine qui me paraît à risque accru.
And can I interrupt you very, very quickly? Is it possible we're having a little bit of problem with the interpretation here, in the sense that we're hearing both the French and the English? If you go to the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and turn interpretation off, I think that should solve the problem. Do you want to try that? If you go to the bottom of the screen of your screen and go to the interpretation bit and turn it off. Is that possible?
I don't see something about interpreter, You
don't. Okay. Well, look, you do continue. We'll try and get to the bottom of it. My apologies for interrupting.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. Un deuxième domaine qui me paraît à risque accru, ce sont les plans de relance économique pour permettre une dépense rapide de ces fonds.
In order to disperse these funds very
En
rapidly,
raison de l'urgence, les gouvernements
because of the
paradoxalement
emergency,
relâchent les
governments
contrôles et allègent
are
les démarches
easing controls
administratives
and
que les
making
entreprises doivent
administrative
effectuer
measures
pour accéder à
easier
ces fonds. Ceci
in order
augmente
to
les risques
facilitate
financiers et
access by
opérationnels
businesses to
et
the
diminue du même
disbursement
coup
of these funds.
l'efficacité de
This
ces
increases
programmes.
financial and
Et il y a un
operational risks
véritable risque
and reduces
d'augmentation
the
des
efficiency of
opportunités
these
de
programs.
fraude et de
And there's also
corruption.
risk of
Un
increasing
troisième
opportunities
et
of
dernier risque
fraud and
accru plus
bribery. And
général que je
the
vois en lien
third
avec cette crise, ce sont les risques
heightened risk
d'intégrité au sein
that
des
I'm
organisations
seeing
publiques
is
elles-mêmes.
integrity risks
Normalement,
within
les employés
public
du secteur public sont
administrations, within
perçus comme
public
ayant des
service.
standards élevés
Generally, public
d'intégrité.
service officers are
Toutefois,
perceived as
la
having
récession
high
peut entraîner
integrity
une
standards.
augmentation des
However, the
malversations
recession
internes et des
could
actes de
give rise
corruption
to an
de leur
increase
part.
of
On
internal
distingue trois
misconduct
facteurs
and
qui
bribery
encouragent de
by
tels actes
public
en
officials
situation
themselves.
de crise.
Now, I'm seeing three
La pression
factors that
financière, d'une part,
can lead
les
to the
nouvelles
increase of this type
occasions,
of
comme le dit
actions.
l'expression,
Firstly, financial
l'occasion fait le
pressure.
larron.
Secondly,
Et
new
aussi le
opportunities.
troisième facteur, le recours à la
And third,
rationalisation de
resorting
l'acte
to
répréhensible comme
rationalizing
technique de neutralisation du
misconduct
jugement
in order
moral.
to avoid any
Donc la
ethical
personne va
misgivings.
justifier
People
son acte en se
can say,
disant que tout le monde le
I'm just
fait,
doing it because
ou
everyone else
si je ne le
is,
fais pas,
or
c'est un
if
autre qui va en
I don't
profiter.
bribe, then someone
De tels
else will
comportements
take
peuvent
advantage of
avoir
the
un impact
situation.
très
This type of
négatif sur la
behavior can have a
perception
very
du
negative
public et
impact
affaiblir
on
l'engagement
public
de celui-ci
perception
dans le
and can
soutien des
also
mesures et des réformes
weaken
mises en place
public
par le gouvernement.
engagement and public
Voilà,
support
c'était les
to
trois risques qui me semblent les plus
measures and
importants en
reforms. So
lien
these are
avec
the
les
three
réponses
major
apportées
risks
par le
that I'm
gouvernement
seeing
pour gérer la
regarding
crise du
government
COVID-19.
response to
Merci.
COVID. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne. And again, apologies to everyone watching. We're having a little bit of difficulty with the interpretation here in the sense that we can hear both the English and the French. I'm in the same boat as the rest of you, and we will try and get to the bottom of that. So my apologies. Let me, in the meantime, throw it over to Drago Kos. Drago, I know you're going to be speaking in English, so I don't think we're going to have a interpretation problem here. The OECD Working Group on Bribery's recent statement underlined very clearly how this pandemic could create conditions ripe for corruption. How exactly do those conditions, or are we seeing those conditions arise? And to what extent are you really seeing this now, the momentum building here and the risks increasing as we go?
Hi, Axel. Good afternoon, all participants.
Could you unmute yourself, Drago?
Can you hear me now? It's okay now. So, hi, Axel. Good afternoon, participants. As we said in our public statement, those are not only conditions ripe for corruption. I am calling them, this is the paradise for corruption. Why? Because governments have to make extremely important decisions in a very limited time and through very easy procedures. So easier and faster are the crucial words when we are fighting the pandemic. And when we talk about those two words, then it's normal that the safeguards which are normally in place do not apply at all anymore, or they apply to much lesser extent. And it's not only, let's say, problems of corruption which can emerge during such, let's say, time we are facing. No. Analyzing what is going on around the world, we can easily see that, say, it's not only the rule of law which is threatened. We can see that, let's say, media freedom is under immense pressure. We see big pressure on the whistleblowers. We see problems in the public procurement area. In some countries, some governments are even using this to, let's say, to start undermining the democracy, basic democratic rules. But let's stick to corruption. See, until now, and I was following also the interventions of participants, it's obvious that we should not only speak about corruption risks anymore in this pandemic, we should speak about clear corruption cases already. And from all, let's say, from the production, when producers are being bribed to switch the order of deliveries, We can speak about corruption and fraud in the delivery of special medical personal protective equipment. We have cases, let's say, from Singapore, where they have paid the equipment which never arrived. We have case in Finland where they paid the equipment which was a much lower quality than they ordered it. We also know that France, together with Europol, is fighting money laundering based on the predicate offense of fraud. So there are things which are going on. It goes to such an extent that the trust of population in some countries is due to corruption committed by their governments or due to allegations of corruption is seriously undermined. I saw one of the participants explain this to his country in Latin America. There is another country which is the EU member state where every Friday citizens are protesting against the government based on the information provided by whistleblowers on possible corruption which allegedly happened during the purchase of the equipment. And since we all know we have the social distancing in place, we have a prohibition of, let's say, grouping in place, those protesters are simply doing their protests by cycling. But it's strange that it happens right in the middle of pandemic, where everybody would expect that that citizens will simply follow what is going on. So we see countries where, let's say, the wives of the prime ministers are intervening for some companies, brothers or cousins of the ministers, brothers of the prime ministers, and so on. So there's many things going on. And of course, the main question here is what to do. The problem here is that when governments are making really important decisions, they have to make them very quick. So usually they don't ask anti-corruption professionals how to mitigate the risks. And even when let's say, risks develop and when corruption happens, then we see that sometimes those professionals are not even let to deal with those risks. And I have to say here, it would be terribly wrong if you would only say that it's the law enforcement agencies only who should fight those risks. No, in all countries, we have a big set of monitoring bodies which can add a lot to mitigate the risks of corruption in current pandemic. We have let's say, the usual balance of powers where legislative branch is controlling the executive branch. We have the state audit institutions. We have anti-corruption commissions. We have law enforcement as normal. We also have the anti-money laundering offices. So if governments are clever, they will engage all those monitoring bodies, of course, in the way that this will not slow down or even hinder the government's efforts to protect lives and health of their citizens, or to develop, let's say, economic packages meant to assist the country, companies, and citizens in surviving the crisis. But if the governments are smart, then they will also apply much stronger monitoring measures, since the usual safeguards are not in place anymore.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Drago, I just want to follow up with a couple of questions, because we're getting lots and lots of questions, as you can imagine, coming through. There's two questions here, and I want very quick answers if we can. You did mention some specific countries. You mentioned France as an example, but this question has come in a few times. Any specific country examples of best practices of COVID-19 emergency procurement is the first question. The second, and this comes from one of the listeners, politicians have a strange reluctance to increase the presence of compliance and ethics functions in the public sector. Could the COVID-19 experience turn the tide? Could this be the opportunity? There's clearly a lot of skepticism out there, but could we see this as an opportunity to turn the tide and get things right?
Okay, the answer to the first question is basically very simple, and it might surprise somebody. In Ukraine, all the procurement of the medical and personal protective equipment goes through an open and publicly accessible website. So everybody knows what is being ordered, everybody knows who is getting the contracts, everybody knows what is the price. So that would be, let's say, one very simple example to follow. On the second question, is this an opportunity? You see, I always consider challenges as opportunities too. But of course, it is, if you ask politicians, it's a bit premature to talk now about, let's say, increasing the participation of compliance officers in the public sector, because they're still fighting the pandemic as such. But I'm sure that if we analyze what in this analysis will have to take place, let's say, at least when the second wave of pandemic will be over, then we will see where were the problems, the loopholes, and I'm sure that it will be very easy to come to the conclusion that enhanced participation of compliance or ethical officers would help us to avoid many bad things.
Drago, thank you very much indeed, and we'll come back to a number of these, I'm sure. Just before we come on to Marco Reggiani, I just want to bring the results of that first poll back up. There you go. So emergency procurement in the healthcare sector, 43% is at the top. Perhaps no great surprises there. And emergency measures and restrictions on movement and communication comes at the bottom. Marco Reggiani, let's get a business perspective, if we could, from you now. What do you see as the main challenges for companies right now to fight the likelihood of risks increasing in this current context?
Thank you, Axel. Well, to say it in a few words, I would say that the companies need to adapt, and quickly. The main challenges that they will face in the near future in order to prevent bribery and corruption will be, in my opinion, the ability to be resilient and proactive. In particular, they will need to adapt to new scenarios and needs, but without overlooking the importance of the respect of the existing safeguards and control. This specific ability will require a greater commitment, but also the greatest engagement of all the leadership team of the companies. And it will involve innovative decision-making processes and more celerity in making choices. Therefore, transparency, ethics, and innovation should be the drivers of such evolution process. Let's talk about innovation. Innovative tools in terms of due diligence, including third-party risk management, contractual standardization, and training programs, from now on will have even more impact and strength, without prejudice to the increasingly central role of the people. Moreover, and look forward, it will be important, in my opinion, to preserve the good things this experience can left us. The importance of the individuals, the role of companies in supporting the country system, and I believe the real will to lead the change for the better.
Okay, Marco, thank you very much indeed. Yes, you can hear me. Marco, thank you, and we'll come back to the business perspective in just a second, but I want to throw it quickly to Barbara Trionfi, who will represent the international media's perspective in this. The role of the media, Barbara, has been critical in providing information at a fast pace on the virus itself, on government responses, etc. What are the main integrity risks to good governance from your perspective, Barbara?
Thank you, Axel, and thank you to the OECD for this conversation. You know, as the virus began to spread around the world and government imposed restrictions to limit the spread of the virus and keep people safe, it immediately became very clear to the International Press Institute, to IPI, that the news media and press freedom were at great risk of being imposed restrictions that would limit their ability to inform citizens and people. So we were at the forefront when we started to gather information about press freedom violations around the world and attacks on journalists specifically aimed at limiting their coverage of the crisis and of government reaction to the crisis. So as of today, IPI has gathered information about over 175 violations around the world since the beginning of March. And the analysis of these data shows that as countries entered in crisis modus, a key effort by governments, both in more and less democratic countries, has been to control the message and to establish a direct communication with the people. And and they failed to offer journalists and the news media the information necessary for them to deliver news which are fair and accurate and give a more balanced picture of what is a very complex reality, and more complex than the one-sided one presented by the government. So today it is clear to all of us today that independent media and journalists play a key role in ensuring integrity and good governance and holding government accountable. And also, as Jeff mentioned at the beginning, those who cover the news should not be harassed and intimidated. And yet we have seen an increase in the harassment since the beginning of the crisis. A mix of, on one hand, limited access to information, and on the other hand, direct attacks against journalists. Journalists are being detained, imprisoned. There are physical attacks to journalists and also against news organizations who dare to question the government line. Additionally to that, the media has also been hit very heavily by the crisis from an economic point of view. The economic crisis generated by the health crisis has hit the media industry already weakened by years of crumbling business models, if you want. So, and this has affected in particular those independent news organizations in countries where there are restrictions on press freedom in general. So as we see this landscape develop throughout the health crisis, we also see that some governments have approved the allocation of public emergency funds for the news media. And there are also conversations ongoing about the need to offer long-term financial support to the news media. And yet we know from previous experience and from what we have seen so far that the likelihood that government-friendly media are going to receive these type of financial support exclusively is very, very high. So our concern is that we are going to come out of this crisis with, on one hand, an increased need for the type of accountability that an independent news media, a pluralistic news media can offer. On the other hand, however, a media landscape in which government-friendly players come out stronger and government critics come out greatly weakened. And this is for us the greatest challenge we're seeing.
Okay, a couple of questions actually coming in for you whilst you're speaking, Barbara, and of course, now they've just sort of jumped up because so many questions are coming in. But one of them was, let me see, here we go. Which countries' governments would you say have been the best and worst in protecting the freedom of press during the pandemic? Okay, putting you on the spot a little bit here. And then the fake news around the pandemic and how governments can balance fighting fake news and protecting freedom of expression. Again, another a huge issue here.
Sure. Well, best and worst. I mean, worst, of course. The some expected ones. China. The fact that we could not gather accurate or credible news out of China at the very beginning of the crisis has challenged the global reaction to the crisis. So this should make us realize how important it is quality news, not only in our country, where we live, but also outside, because the world it's in such a situation, it comes very close together. We have looked at Hungary, again, countries where press freedom was heavily affected before, a member of the European Union, and yet a country that at the beginning of the crisis of the pandemic, they passed an emergency law that heavily restricts news media, and exactly the fact that the very few existing independent news media have, on one hand, no access at all to government funding, to public ads, and so on. On the other hand, also are affected by a weaker economy, is going to lead to a situation where the few existing independent news media are going to disappear, and that somehow the European Union mechanisms have failed to react to this and to prevent something from this to have from happening inside the union itself. On the fake news issue, yes, we have seen a spike in disinformation, which is particularly concerning as it relates to a health crisis. However, what has concerned IPI even more is basically that the governments have been given the tools to pass so-called anti-fake news laws, which allow government-closed institutions to censor directly information from news media to social media and so on without judicial processes. And very often these anti-fake news laws have been used precisely to censor not so much disinformation, but anybody who would criticize a government. So again, IPI's view on that is that imposing restrictions to information is not the way ahead. The way ahead, if we want to fight disinformation, is to promote those players who offer accurate information. And this is the independent news media that we're seeing being weakened at the moment.
Okay, very good. Barbara, thank you very much indeed for that. Okay, look, just before we continue, I want to put up a second polling question, and this will give us a sense of the temperature around the world from the attendees. Are governments, let's put up the second one if we could, Rania, there you go. Are governments and businesses doing enough to mitigate the corruption risks in the response? Yes, no, and not sure. I think I can imagine what we're going to hear on the result of this one. But look, whilst we're waiting for that result, and do vote now and submit that response, let me go back to Marco, because a question has come through on business, and it's an interesting one, and it goes like this, Marco. Globally, the leadership of political leaders and the political leaders' handling of the crisis has been mixed at best, says this question. Will their example drive business and social behavior, or will business leaders feel pressure to step up and fill the integrity gap in their place? And of course, let's throw in there as well, Marco, this tremendously difficult financial context that businesses are operating in now, and the pressure that business is feeling despite the financial constraints to do something. What are you hearing, and what are you advising them, Marco?
Well, for sure, over the next few months, there will be matters that need to be overseen in a very specific way, like, for example, budgets will be reoriented considering the new challenges posed by the COVID-19 emergency. But also in this scenario, I think the company will have to continue to focus on third parties risk management and to look for any potential frauds and disputes. This will be very crucial for the success of any company, also for the reputation, but also for the economic result.
Right, but this question of how businesses are expected to do so much more on a shoestring budget, I guess, is a sort of crude way of putting it. What are you advising?
Management and potential. And yeah,
Marco, we're losing your audio.
With greater digitalization.
Can you hear us, Marco?
Hello?
Yeah, we're having difficulty with your audio. Try again.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. But, well, in a few words, my advice is greater digitalization and artificial intelligence tools, as well lean and punctual decision-making processes. This will be, in my opinion, the support needed in this difficult time. Artificial intelligence tools, greater digitalization, and lean and punctual decision-making process. Transparency, in one word.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Marco. Let's have a quick look at the result of that second poll question, if we could, Rania. If you could pull up that result. There you go. Governments and businesses doing enough to mitigate the corruption risks. 65% say no. Only 9% of you say yes. Drago, I guess no great surprises there. A lot of questions are coming through on the government piece. An interesting one, I thought, was this lack of international cooperation at this critical time compared to, say, the response to the financial crisis in 2008. Could something like this help, or do we need to see governments sorting out their own houses before they could act together?
But the problem is that you cannot sort your own house in the current, let's say, conditions of countries being tied together so strongly. So yes, of course, what we saw, it was really disappointing. We saw country closing in, even in the, let's say, cases like procurement of the equipment and so on. But there was almost no cooperation to prevent and to suppress corruption risks too. But that was not so much on the, let's say, that was more the consequence of the fact that some governments, either they really did not have time and resources to deal with it, or second, they thought that there's no right, that there's time is not right to fight corruption. They're, of course, terribly wrong. There always has to be time to fight corruption. So that was the main problem. The fighting corruption was no priority at all, despite the fact that everybody knew that the easier and faster procedures open so many possibilities, so many chances for corruption to bloom. And this was the main problem. So they were either they really did not have time, or they were pretending that they don't have time and resources to do so. Because we saw governments which were able to maintain the, let's say, some standards of prevention and suppression, but we also saw, and we still see them in countries where everything has fallen apart. Let's say, European Union has issued a guidance on how to deal with public procurement in the time of current pandemic. And from this guidance, it's obvious, let's say, that the most important conditions, let's say publication of tenders, minimum number of bidders and so on, are not being respected, don't have to be respected anymore. But this has not found any, let's say, answer on the other side. So we open some big holes, and we did not watch them. What will happen? What will come through them? And this was the biggest problem. So the governments, some of them really were not able to do it, especially countries which are really badly hit by pandemic, because not only the, let's say, the healthcare sector, but also the law enforcement agencies and other monitoring bodies were either A, included in the preventive measures, let's say, ensuring that people are really staying at home, or B, they had to stay at home themselves. But in such occasion, for sure, it never happened that the whole law enforcement corps would be engaged in medical issues. Mm-hmm. So countries which really would want to do something were in position to do something by, if not by engaging the regular units to fight risks of corruption, so more than by organizing small task forces to deal with it. But again and again, I will repeat this again, it's not only for the law enforcement agencies to deal with it, the whole system has to react. And sometimes it looked at fighting the medical aspects of the pandemic, we forgot on everything else.
Yeah, and in fact, on that point, a question comes in that says a number of public governance-oriented multi-stakeholder initiatives bring government, private sector, civil society together to reach joint decisions. This is part of this OECD forum, of course, and this platform. But joint decisions, for example, concerning investments in public infrastructure, could this be a way forward to strengthen integrity and accountability in COVID-19 economic stimulus packages?
Well, I would say that this is the only way forward.
Yeah.
Now, if we can understand that there was really a matter of urgency, that governments had to react very fast in fighting the medical aspects, I don't see any government which will be able to produce those economic stimulus packages without strong participation of the private sector, because the private sector knows what are the problems, what are the possible solutions. Of course, the governments will never be able to, let's say, to answer to all the requests of the private sector, especially in the crisis like this one. But at least they have to know what are the problems, and they have to know what are the most burning problems. Without participation of private sector here, I'm afraid that billions which will be spent through those economic packages might get lost too.
Okay, Anne, I'm going to come back to you in just a second, but before I do, I'm going to go to Barbara quickly. But whilst I'm doing that, I wonder if you could just have a fiddle around with your interpretation tool. If you click on the three little dots at the top of your screen, and then choose language interpretation on, choose a language, and then select original is what I'm being told to tell you to do. Try that, and then when we come back to you, we'll see if that works. Barbara, in the meantime, questions are coming through on whistleblowing, and there is another a separate webinar on whistleblowing coming up in the future. But this is the question here. Some democratic governments are trying to control the news in the UK. We've seen nurses fired for speaking up about difficulties. What can societies do now to help whistleblowers? Do we believe extra protection will be introduced for whistleblowers post a vaccine, i.e. in the new normal ahead?
Thank you, Alex. Yes, indeed, whistleblower protection and laws to protect whistleblowers are a key aspect of independent journalism as well. Whistleblowers themselves contribute uniquely to independent journalism, and they deserve protection. What can and again, going back to what I mentioned before, as we have seen attacks on journalists, clearly the attacks are also to their sources in this general effort that IBI has monitored to control the information, to control the message. What can we do about it? You know, we need to come out of this crisis with a feeling that we give more value to press freedom and to independent, pluralistic journalism as a public good. These may lead also to changes and business models of news organizations. As I said, maybe more public funding is needed whenever possible to support the type of journalism that society needs, public interest journalism society needs, and yet whenever public funding is used for this purpose, we need to define very clear criteria to ensure editorial independence, and so ensure that, as I said, that the information we receive is not only accurate, but is also diverse. From society point of view, journalism are as strong as their community of audiences. We see a number of political leaders who are directly attacking journalists or seeking to discrediting journalists in general, and it is up to society to stand up and refuse this type of message and refuse this type of rhetoric that is being very much abused. And on the other hand, it's up, however, to certain government to use the tools of diplomacy and strengthening existing international and multinational mechanisms to put pressure on those who fail to create the conditions for journalists to operate safely. So I think that we just have to make sure that we come out of this crisis with a much more awareness about the unique importance of public interest journalism.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you, Barbara. Anne, I'm going to come back to you now, and we'll see if this interpretation bit is working. Let's get a general sense to you from you on what you think governments need to be doing now, and I'll frame this in a question. It's a slight aside, but it's an interesting question nevertheless. The IMF has committed $1 trillion to countries to help them during this pandemic, seemingly without much demand for oversight. What are the sort of minimum requirements that international organizations like the IMF, like the World Bank, should insist on as a condition for receiving money like that? So give us your overall feeling of what governments need to be doing now generally, and then maybe you can touch on that question.
Alex, I'm afraid that because of the sound, because I was already on original audio, I'm sorry. I hope it will work. Pour répondre à votre question, merci beaucoup. Une bonne gestion des risques, à mon avis, pour les gouvernements, les conseils qu'on pourrait donner, c'est vraiment de ne pas se limiter aux risques à court terme liés directement à la crise du Covid, mais aussi de penser à englober la gestion des risques à plus long terme qui vont découler de la récession économique. Dans le domaine des marchés publics, je dirais les mesures à court terme qui sont, à mon avis, celles qu'on peut déjà prendre, c'est de vraiment mettre l'accent sur une gestion pragmatique, souple, documentée et transparente des contrats, c'est-à-dire assouplir les délais, chercher le dialogue avec les soumissionnaires et les fournisseurs et si nécessaire convenir d'une solution intermédiaire avec eux et surtout fixer ça dans le contrat, prévoir des avenants au contrat afin d'avoir une trace écrite. Ensuite, c'est aussi s'assurer une gestion de la continuité des affaires en dépit de la crise. Donc, c'est d'éviter d'annuler et d'interrompre l'exécution des contrats si cette exécution n'est pas mise en danger par la crise. Ensuite, ce qui est important, c'est régler rapidement les créances ouvertes sans attendre les délais de paiement afin d'éviter que les fournisseurs ne se retrouvent en manque de liquidité et qu'ils doivent licencier du personnel. Et également essayer de voir la possibilité de payer des acomptes supplémentaires si nécessaire, bien sûr toujours en adaptant le contrat pour avoir une trace écrite. Ce qui est aussi important, c'est de développer des lignes directrices sur les stratégies à développer dans le domaine des marchés publics et des contrats en cas de crise et de les communiquer à tous les responsables des adjudications, mais aussi aux fournisseurs, aux soumissionnaires pour des raisons de transparence. Ensuite, par exemple, la conférence des achats de la Confédération a émis des lignes directrices pour les centres d'achat au début de la crise pour nous donner un peu une feuille de route, des indications, comment procéder avec ces situations particulières. Ce qui est aussi important en vue quand il y a des crises, c'est de vraiment favoriser la mise sur pied de contrats cadres. Ceci permet d'éviter de passer par des adjudications de gré à gré, donc dans l'urgence, et de devoir travailler avec des partenaires qui n'ont pas subi un processus de sélection et pour lesquels on n'a pas pu faire une évaluation des risques. Ce qui est aussi important, c'est d'augmenter la transparence en publiant les décisions qui sont prises sur les mesures urgentes. Par exemple, chez nous, au département des Affaires étrangères, nous avons défini et délimité très précisément les frais que nous étions prêts à couvrir en raison de la crise, en envoyant une lettre à nos régisseurs, à nos partenaires, afin qu'ils sachent exactement ce à quoi ils ont droit et ce à quoi ils n'ont pas droit. Ce qui peut être aussi une bonne chose, c'est de mettre en place un système central de suivi des prix et des fournisseurs pour les produits clés. Et puis, bien sûr, de pouvoir allonger les délais légaux en cas de recours. Donc, toutes ces mesures que je viens de mentionner, des mesures à court terme, doivent forcément s'accompagner d'un bon monitorage et de contrôle. Et il est en particulier important de soumettre toutes les procédures d'adjudication de gré à gré, des procédures urgentes, à un audit et à la surveillance, et ceci dès que possible. Yes?
For trying. Unfortunately, we have not been able to resolve this interpretation issue, and I thank the interpreter for speaking louder and trying to overcome that. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to. We will continue trying. But thank you anyway, Anne. I want to come back to Drago, if I may, and ask. I know some people probably had a difficulty on understanding that last part of Anne's response. So let me ask you, Drago, a similar question. The sorts of conditions that need to be placed on help for governments and help for countries, by the IMF, by the World Bank, by other organizations. What are we seeing now? Is it enough? Do we need to see more going forward? Drago.
Well, it's absolutely not enough. Even if the conditionality is imposed at the beginning, what we can see, let's say, when the fiscal years are coming to an end. I saw so many times in my life that, let's say, the international organizations were simply either loosening their conditions or simply giving up, because the countries would otherwise not fulfill the basic conditions to get this financial assistance. And then international organizations will feel they did something wrong. So conditioning is extremely important, because otherwise we cannot make many governments around the world to follow the standards which we expect them to follow. But it is not just, it's not enough just to have the conditions in the basic, let's say, contract or the basic document. There has to be somebody who will oversee how those conditions are being fulfilled, and who will have enough courage at the end of the year to say, sorry guys, you did not fulfill the conditions, so the funding will either disappear or we'll limit it to the extent to which you have fulfilled the conditions. And this is missing, a bit more courage is missing.
Why? Okay, yeah. And are you seeing that anywhere, that courage? Are you seeing signs of it anywhere? And who would you hold up as best in show right now?
Well, I saw IMF doing great things in Ukraine. So they were applying quite a lot of pressure, and they basically forced the government, the previous one, to make some really good decisions. But of course, we have to be aware of the fact that, let's say, no matter how strong the pressure of international organizations is, if the governments do not want to do things, they won't do it. They won't do them. They will pretend that they're doing something. They will simply, let's say, act as they're following those conditions. But at the end of the day, we will not see any improvement there.
Okay, and a question, actually, I'll just very quickly, Drago, stay with you. A question comes through on this. In terms of influencing better policies in governments, what steps and strategies could organizations like the OECD pursue in a situation like this? Could financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank and the ADB be in a better position to influence policy making?
Well, currently, I'm afraid that international organizations do not have a lot of time to influence any of the governments, because the things are developing so quickly, especially in the, let's say, medical area, that this opportunity has gone. What can be done now when countries are preparing the economic packages? This is another story. This is not developing so fast, and here there is room for let's say, for action of international organizations. The only problem is, see, some of the organizations have a limited number of member states. So OECD can only influence its member states, plus some countries which are sort of part of some, let's say, neighboring policies and so on. Of course, there are organizations which are covering much broader range of countries. But even if you forget this limitation, I would say that would require from those international organizations today to focus much more on what the governments are doing than they're doing it already. So this is not only an urgent time for the governments, it's also an urgency for the international organizations.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Drago. Marco, let me come back to you. What a business, there's a few, the multi-pronged in a way, this question, but there are, what do businesses expect now from governments? And we've seen a lot of the sort of support that we've seen from governments for business. But what do they also expect from international organizations like the OECD to ensure that standard due diligence and risk assessment measures are being respected right now?
Thank you, Axel. Well, from international organizations like OECD, I think the businesses should expect that they continue to maintain a very relevant role in requiring governments the exploitation of emerging technologies in their advocacy activities. But I also believe, beside this, that international organizations could expand their role and assist companies in the training paths, capitalizing on knowledge and know-how. And I also believe they can also support the supervision of the implementation of the new policies that the companies will implement in the near future. Let me say also for governments, I think that the most important for businesses is the leveraging of emerging technologies to consent companies to better manage risk related to bribery, corruption, and fraud. This is very important. A couple of examples. Implementing systems to guarantee further transparency in beneficial ownership information, and also facilitate access to official third parties information. Moreover, governments could also try to support the implementation of technology to promote accountability across the entire public procurement lifecycle.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Marco. All right, let me move it on, the discussion on, because I'm seeing we've got about 20 minutes to go, and there's still questions keep flooding in. So thank you to all of the attendees for asking their questions. I've got a couple of general questions for myself, and then I'll put some of the other ones to the panelists. And the first one relates to technology and digital solutions, and a question did come through on this. The transition, the fourth industrial revolution, the way technology is being used, how is it impacting generally the fight against corruption, and what are the opportunities and the threats now? Drago, let me throw that to you first.
Well, we were always saying that the bad guys are a step ahead of us, the good guys, if we are the good guys. But let's say the technology now is giving us the opportunity that we narrow this margin. And as we saw that, let's say during this pandemic, that the way of our functioning, of our living has completely changed. We're doing most of the things through internet and so on. There are also possibilities that we would use the new technologies to fight corruption to a much bigger extent than we do it right now. In the OECD, we are discussing how to use the blockchain technologies for 2 years now already in the fight against corruption. And we see a great potential there. So there are possibilities, there are chances. We just have to bring all, let's say, our deliberations to the end, and then to develop some guidelines on how to do it. Of course, we should not be too naive and think that the bad guys will not, again, find out a way how to run ahead of us. But if we keep this in mind, that development of new technologies should not only serve the purpose of making our lives easier, faster, and so on, but also of making our lives more honest, with high level of integrity, and we should deliberately think about it, then things will be done for sure. But it will take some time, of course, but it is possible.
Marco, and apologies to Barbara and Anne, I'll come back to you in just a second, but Marco, I'd be interested to get your view with your business hat on the technology piece, and whether the businesses you work with feel this is something that can be capitalized upon in this fight against corruption generally.
Well, basically, I agree with Drago, because I think that we have also considered that we live in a world where most of the times, the fastest you are, the better you are considered, the better your reputation, the highest is your reputation. So this pose as embedded in this concept a lot of risk, including a lot of risk on transparency and integrity of the people. So the reaction or to be proactive on this is very important. New technologies will be, in my opinion, very important to tackle corruption, to tackle misleading behavior, and to, let me say, certify transparency on the decision-making process.
Okay. Barbara, a more general question for you on the media in terms of holding governments accountable. I know you've touched on this in some of your responses, but clearly some governments have grasped this opportunity now in fighting the pandemic to strengthen their power. That could clearly extend well beyond the medical crisis here. What is the role, do you think, of the media, and how well is the media playing that role in holding governments to account right now?
Thank you. Well, certainly, from my point of view, and I think that an opinion
Not hearing you very well, actually, Barbara. I don't know if... Can
you hear me?
Yeah, now I can, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So certainly from IPI's point of view, and it seems to be also an opinion shared by other panelists, it seems that independent journalism clearly contributes to holding governments accountable. And from, if you want, from in an OECD context, we need to ensure that the existence of pluralistic news media becomes a condition for participation by governments in various programs. So what IPI has been pushing for is, on one hand, that the distribution of international development assistance needs to be conditional to press freedom guarantees. And these includes, on one hand, protection of journalists, journalist safety, and whistleblowers, certainly. On the other hand, also more complex measures to preempt media capture. So control of the media from an economic perspective. The other aspect that IPI has been campaigning for is the need to develop programs to support investigative journalism parallel to the allocation of development assistance, to the allocation of aid. I'll give you a positive example, a successful example in this area. IPI currently runs a program called the Investigative Journalists for Europe, which supports cross-border cooperation between journalists within the EU. And the funds that IPI and other parts and sub-grants to journalists come from 90% from the European Commission. When we started the program in 2018-19, a number of projects successfully revealed corruption and embezzlement of EU funds given to the member states, offering them the tools to improve EU programs and ensure that the funds are used to fulfill the stated purposes. So supporting, comparing to the overall amount of funds that is being given for development, for aid, the amount that is given to promote investigative journalism in this area is minimal, is a very cheap way to ensure accountability. And IPI's project also has shown how this money that comes from government sources, comes from the EU, so it is a government source, can be channeled to the journalistic community through various steps and protections that civil society can guarantee and ensure that the journalists are feel that they can carry out these type of investigations independently. I can't hear you.
Now it's my turn to get this wrong. Right, thank you very much indeed, Barbara. And Anne, I'm going to come back to you, and we're going to try one more thing. I'm seeing a lot of messages coming through from attendees saying to other attendees, turn off interpretation and switch to the original language. So maybe it's something we need to be doing as well. But while they are trying to do that, I have a couple of questions that relate to the first poll, and we saw that emergency procurement in the healthcare sector. Our attendees believe that entails the highest integrity risks. Let me ask you this: what should the appropriate oversight bodies be doing to increase transparency, specifically in emergency public procurement? What can we just address that very specifically? A lot of questions are coming through on that.
Oui, merci pour la question. Qu'est-ce que peut faire donc les services de contrôle pour assurer plus de transparence, si j'ai bien compris, par rapport au marché public? C'était ça la question?
In public procurement. Was that your question?
Yes, it was. That was my question. Yes.
Okay. Alors, oui, donc. À mon avis, pour assurer plus de transparence, je pense qu'un des meilleurs moyens, c'est la communication, par exemple, des résultats de leurs audits, de leurs contrôles, sur une plateforme Internet accessible à tout le public.
Audit findings should be published on an
également,
open internet
donc, le recours systématique à la digitalisation.
Digitalization should be more widely used, and I think this is a real challenge that has come up in this crisis, clearly we're not advanced enough in terms of digitalization. And regarding oversight and audit institutions, they also need to be involved early on in any crisis management. Now, this is true for any public administration. People are working from home. They don't always have access to data. They don't always have access to the tools. They can't go to the actual offices to carry out their audits. So it would be necessary to introduce technical systems whereby they can have access to data and remain working from home. But that's a physical obstacle in carrying out audits. Then there's also the question of a schedule. How can oversight and audit institutions be involved early on? Because you have governments who are in crisis management mode and not really favorable to audits and control. So sometimes audit and control institutions are forgotten, they're left behind, or sometimes they're deliberately put aside. Now, in my situation, I had to implement a new digital contract management system, and our own internal audit had to carry out the audit of the implementation of this new system. And in my personal experience, we do realize that it's extremely difficult to have an audit while the implementation is ongoing. And that's why I think these oversight and audit institutions need to be more of a support function than a control function. Control should only come later, but in the first stage of crisis management, audit institutions and oversight institutions need to be a support, or maybe specific audit procedures could be introduced.
Okay, thank you very much again, Anne. Marco, to you, on the back of that, what has COVID-19 taught us, do you think, in respect to emergency procurement? Is it are these lessons and the lessons that you think we could learn from this, have they been learned and will they be used going forward?
Well, my belief is that going forward, we have to put more resources and commitment on third-party risk management. Once you have a wall around your procurement staff, your procurement activities, if you build a compliance wall around you, you can select the third parties and better manage the risk of fraud or corruption or bribery. In this respect, I would say once again that artificial intelligence tools are, in my opinion, the better way for the next future. To be more efficient, more fast, and more transparent.
Okay, thank you. And in fact, same question to you, Drago. I meant to throw that to you, but thank you, Marco, for your response to that. But Drago, the same question to you in terms of and what we should have learned from specifically with regard to emergency procurement, what we should have learned on the back of this.
Well, first of all, that if we get rid of some safeguards, we have to introduce some new ones. Of course, not slowing down the emergency procedures, which have to be very fast. And Anne has offered already so many solutions. I would just say that we should not forget any of the steps in the procurement processes, because at any of the stages something can go wrong, and it's either, let's say, use of external experts which assist, maybe even sometimes representatives of civil society who will be present when decisions will be taken, reporting on all those cases, and I would say thorough analysis of the biggest public procurement cases. It should not happen that it happened in one of the countries that a company which is specialized for producing and delivering gambling equipment got the biggest contract for the medical equipment. So each of the stages and each of the types of the procedures which are applied can be, let's say, followed or accompanied by a special type of monitoring, which will not be a burden at all for those who have to make decisions real quick.
Mm-hmm. Another question comes through, and it's something, and I'll stick with you, Drago, on this, because I threw you a question earlier about opportunity and finding opportunity in all of this, and this relates to the rule of law, and it goes like this: do governments have an opportunity to become more creative in dealing with companies and individuals, and maybe other governments, acting to undermine integrity systems, for example, by emulating a form of the World Bank's blacklist process, without necessarily waiting for a criminal conviction in the courts? I mean, I guess we have to get a little bit creative in an unprecedented time like this, no?
Yes, of course. And this is where I see the opportunity, not only for the enhanced cooperation between the public and the private sector, which is developing, but it's developing very slow. So I really hope that due to this pandemic, the governments, because now we mainly see the problems at the public side, that the governments will understand that the private sector companies can be their, let's say, partner in fighting all sorts of things, including corruption. So if this will be the lesson learned after the pandemic, I'll be very, very happy. Second, I would agree with your participant who is saying that why would we have to wait until the judgments all the time? You see, we see the blacklisting functions. It functions well. Not only the one which was just mentioned, but also, let's say, the Financial Action Task Force. Countries are extremely afraid of being put on the blacklist, because this means that their international loans will get extremely expensive and so on. So we try to do this the same in the working group from Bribery to develop a blacklist of countries which do not want to fight corruption. Unfortunately, we did not succeed, because countries want to be on a safe side, not wanting to find themselves one day on the blacklist.
And who should oversee this? I mean, is it organizations like the OECD who should be pulling all of this together? And how do we make something like this happen?
Well, it depends on the reason why countries would be put on the blacklist. If it's corruption, normally it should be one of the anti-corruption international bodies. The problem is, as I said already, the working group on bribery is composed only of 44 countries of the world. UNODC, which is dealing with the implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption, they have much bigger participation. They have almost 200 countries, but their procedures are much softer than ours. So it will be difficult to find somebody who would hold such a blacklist. Except if we find the agreement between all.
I've just lost your audio, Drago. I just lost your audio.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you again, yeah.
But my microphone turns off from time to time automatically, preventing me to talk too much. So this would be a possibility. If we speak about the financial aspects, let's say money laundering, this is solved. We have the FATF, which is dealing with it. Let's say public procurement, we have either the IMF or the World Bank. So it will not be so difficult to find international organizations which would be responsible for drawing and maintaining those blacklists. But the problem here is, those international organizations cannot make this decision by themselves. It's always their member states making the decision. And trust me, there will be many, many objections to the idea.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I am very wary of the time. We've got about 5 minutes left. So what I want to do with that 5 minutes is get a very quick final thought from each of you.
Axel, I can't hear you.
You can't hear me now? Can you hear me? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Can everyone else hear me? Yeah, you got me. Okay. I was just saying 5 minutes or so to go, and what I want to do is get a very quick final thought from each of you that you can leave us with, and the question I'll throw, a general question to each of you is yes, what we've learned from this unprecedented context, but what needs how this needs to be acted on, whether you feel confident this will be acted on. There are skeptics abound out there, of course, and I just wonder whether there is a message of hope that can be provided. Again, it comes back to this opportunity from this that we've discussed, Drago. Anne, let me start with you. If you speak quietly, very quietly, Anne, and the interpreter speaks very loudly, then we might just have cracked this this situation. Anne, go ahead.
Thank you. Pour moi, toute crise est une chance de repenser les choses et d'entrevoir l'avenir autrement, et surtout de s'améliorer. En l'occurrence, c'est aussi une opportunité de rendre plus visibles certains problèmes, tels que la corruption et les risques d'intégrité. En Suisse, par exemple, il nous manque parfois des scandales, des grands scandales dans ce domaine pour sensibiliser les gens et pour initier certains changements. Et la crise du Covid est une situation inédite pour nous. Et j'espère que nous saurons saisir cette occasion pour repenser les processus de travail, pour repenser la collaboration, pour développer une véritable culture de l'intégrité, en particulier dans le domaine des marchés publics. Et je profite de l'occasion pour rappeler la recommandation du Conseil sur l'intégrité publique, qui est vraiment un outil, un très bon outil pour aider les gouvernements à mettre en place un système solide d'intégrité dans leur pays. Et c'est vraiment ce que je souhaite à mon pays et à tous les pays. Merci.
And thank you very much indeed. Barbara, same thing to you. You've given us a lot on press freedom, on whistleblowing, on the bravery of the media and their role and their duty in uncovering what needs to be uncovered here. Where does this go now?
I think again, I think we see some.
I think you're on mute, Barbara.
Can you hear me?
Can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
No.
Anybody else?
I can hear you.
Oh, you can?
Yeah.
Try again, Barbara.
Hey, can you hear me now, Axel?
I can't, but go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead. So I see a number of opportunities. Some I'm skeptical about. Some I do think that will actually be implemented. On one hand, we need to strengthen multilateral mechanisms to protect press freedom. And as Drago said, this depends on the member states. So it will be up to the member states to understand if the mechanisms we have in place to protect specifically press freedom and independent journalism can be further strengthened. I referred before to identifying functioning models to provide public support to the media, not only public service broadcasting, which is already in place, but to a more broad number of media outlets. I think there are a lot of analyses and studies. IPI is preparing one as well. I think we will be able to come up with good models there. So I'm less skeptical about it. Whether governments will be interested in implementing them, it's a long way. What I am confident about is that the news industry itself will identify models strategies to come out stronger. They have to in order to survive. One is solidarity, greater solidarity between media actors, and the other is developing functioning business models internally. And what we are seeing in IPI is analyzing that in the moment the advertising sector cannot be trusted upon as a supporter for the independent news. News organizations are being successful in identifying other types of revenues, the most important of which is by creating communities, audiences that supports them. So basically turning into media. Very often these are online-based media that are supported entirely by their community, both financially, but also the support of the community will offer the protection they need to stand up against restrictive government. So I am confident that the industry will go in that direction. Thank you.
Barbara, thank you. Marco, to you, how can businesses come out of this deeply difficult environment in a better place, do you think?
Thank you, Axel. Well, I think that I would put it in very simple. We have to remind the people have and always will have a central role in companies. In a different way, a crisis is not a blank check. Individual rights are at the center of our life, are still the core of our life. Also in companies. Companies that during the lockdown will maintain as much as possible the previous existing condition in terms of resources, and during the lockdown, looking forward to the future, will improve the materialization, artificial intelligence, simplification of processes. I think these companies will benefit in the long term, for sure.
Thank you very much indeed, Marco. And a final question to you, Drago. You've been in this space for a while. Are you surprised, Drago, by what we've seen in terms of growing risk, in terms of risk to the whole compliance piece, the integrity piece, the issue of bribery, or would you have said this was to be expected?
Well, I would say that this was expected. What I'm surprised of is that, let's say, that countries which also generally and otherwise proved to be effective in the fight against corruption have proven to be effective also in the new conditions. Countries which were not so effective also now did not prove any special effectiveness. And here I don't speak about the images of the countries, because you always have countries which are pretending they're doing a great job. They're not. So this is, let's say, the COVID-19 pandemic is a very simple proof, or let's say sign, which countries are really effective and which not. What remains for us to be done, let's say in the OECD, let's say the working group on bribery has already launched the questionnaire to learn about some consequences of the pandemic to our narrow area of foreign bribery. But I think, and I will try to convince my colleagues in the OECD that as soon as possible, we would analyze all the steps in the development of this pandemic crisis from the medical point of view, from the economic point of view, social point of view, and to develop some sort of document similar to what we have in the area of big construction projects. So because now we are aware of all the risks, and I'm sure that we can produce a very good piece of paper which will maybe not serve a purpose for this pandemic, but for the next one, because there'll be the next one for sure.
Okay, Drago, thank you very much indeed. I will thank all of the speakers in a minute, but just before I do that, final poll for you. Rania, maybe you can pop this one up. We're not going to post the result of this one, and you'll see why. And it is just asking whether you'd be interested in participating in more webinars in the OECD Anti-Corruption Integrity Forum series, provided we get the interpretation tab issue sorted out. Maybe we should stick on the end of that. And they will, without a doubt. Just to announce a few upcoming webinars, 20th of May, there's more on the OECD Integrity Handbook. 22nd of May, whistleblower protection, something we've talked about a lot today. And the 4th of June, I'm just seeing, emergency procurement will be the focus of a webinar. It just remains for me to thank all of our speakers now, and indeed to thank everyone attending. We had a really good turnout, and the number of questions was testament to just how engaged everyone was. But let me thank Deputy Secretary General Jeff Schlagenhauf for his opening remarks, Drago Kos, Marco Reggiani, Anne Rivera, and Barbara Trionfi. Thank you to all of you for your participation today, and we hope to see everyone again soon. Thank you very much indeed.